The October rain fell steadily on Boston, turning the cemetery into a watercolor painting of grays and blacks. I stood under my umbrella, watching as they lowered my husband's casket into the ground. 48 years of marriage, ending in a rectangular hole in the earth on a Tuesday afternoon. My name is Jolene Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and until 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was Winston Whitmore's wife, mother to our son Garrett, grandmother to 2 beautiful girls I rarely saw. I was the woman who kept our home in Beacon Hill running smoothly for nearly 5 decades. I was the woman who stood by her husband through law school, through his early struggling years as an attorney, through his eventual success as a partner in one of Boston's most prestigious firms. The funeral was well attended. Winston had been respected in legal circles, known for his sharp mind and his discretion handling high-profile cases. Colleagues in expensive suits stood in clusters, murmuring condolences that sounded rehearsed. A few of Winston's college friends, now elderly themselves, had made the journey despite the weather. And there was family. My sister Mary Ann, who had flown in from Seattle, a handful of distant cousins, and Garrett. My son stood on the opposite side of the grave, which should have been my first sign that something was wrong. He was 46 years old, with Winston's strong jaw and my green eyes. He'd followed his father into law, working at a different firm, but always seeking Winston's approval. Today he looked uncomfortable in his black suit, shifting his weight from foot to foot, checking his watch as though his father's burial was an inconvenience. The minister spoke words about eternal rest and God's mercy. I barely heard them. My mind kept replaying the last conversation I'd had with Winston, 3 weeks before the heart attack that killed him. We'd been having dinner, salmon that I'd prepared carefully, knowing it was his favorite. He'd been distracted, pushing food around his plate. "Winston, is everything all right?" I'd asked. "Fine, Jolene, just tired from work." It was always work. For 48 years, it had been work that kept him late at the office. Work that took him on weekend trips. Work that explained away the distance that had grown between us like ivy on an old wall. So gradual you didn't notice until it had covered everything. I'd accepted it. That's what women of my generation did. We accepted. We accommodated. We made ourselves smaller so our husbands could be bigger. The minister finished his prayer. People began to approach me, offering those awkward condolences that never sound quite right. "He's in a better place. At least he didn't suffer. You were so lucky to have all those years together." Lucky. I let the words sit in my mouth like ashes. I was shaking hands with one of Winston's law partners when I noticed Garrett moving through the crowd. He wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, her arm linked through his. She was younger than me, perhaps in her early 60s, with carefully styled silver blonde hair and a black dress that was just a bit too fashionable for a funeral. I didn't recognize her. They approached the gravesite, and something about the way she moved made my breath catch. There was familiarity in her steps, as though she'd walked this path before, as though she belonged here. Garrett stopped a few feet from me. His face was set in an expression I couldn't quite read, defiance mixed with something that might have been guilt. The woman beside him squeezed his arm, and he straightened his shoulders. "Everyone." Garrett's voice cut through the murmured conversations, loud enough to make people stop and turn. "I'd like to introduce someone. This is Vivienne Prescott." The name meant nothing to me. I stared at the woman, trying to place her, a colleague, a client. Why was Garrett making introductions at his father's funeral? What Garrett said next shattered my world more completely than Winston's death ever could. "This is the true woman in my father's life, and the true mother to me." The words hung in the rain-soaked air. I watched his mouth form them, but my brain couldn't process their meaning. True woman, true mother, as if I were somehow false, as if 48 years of marriage, of raising his son, of keeping his home, were somehow counterfeit. I looked at Vivienne Prescott. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes. Triumph, satisfaction. She met my gaze without flinching, without shame. "Garrett," I whispered, but he wasn't finished. Dad loved her for over 30 years. She understood him in ways no one else could. She was his partner, his confidant, his true companion. His voice grew stronger with each word, as though he'd been waiting years to say this. "She's been more of a mother to me than you ever were." The crowd had gone absolutely silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would react. Marianne grabbed my arm, but I barely felt her touch. My entire body had gone numb. And just so you know, Garrett continued, his voice now cold and businesslike, the house on Beacon Hill isn't yours anymore. Dad left it to Vivian in his will. You'll need to be out by the end of the month. 30 years. The number echoed in my head. Garrett was 46. 30 years meant Winston had been with this woman since our son was 16. Half of our marriage had been a lie. More than half. I looked around at the faces watching me. Some showed pity. Others showed curiosity. A few, those who must have known, showed guilt. How many people at this funeral had known about Winston's other life? How many times had I been the fool, speaking proudly of my husband, while others smiled with knowledge I didn't possess? I could have made a scene. I could have screamed, cried, demanded answers. But 48 years of maintaining dignity in all circumstances had trained me well. Instead, I simply looked at my son, this man I'd carried in my body, raised with all my love, sacrificed for again and again, and I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Not here. Not now. Not to people who had already decided I was the interloper in my own life. I turned and walked away from my husband's grave. Marianne hurried after me, but I barely registered her presence. I walked through the cemetery, past rows of headstones marking other lives, other deaths, other families with their own secrets and lies. Behind me, I heard someone start to speak, picking up where the funeral had been interrupted. Life went on. Even when your world ended, life went on. Marianne drove me home, to the house on Beacon Hill that apparently wasn't mine anymore. We didn't speak during the drive. What could she say? What could anyone say? When we pulled up to the brownstone where I'd lived for 42 years, I looked at it as though seeing it for the first time. The carefully maintained facade, the window boxes I planted each spring, the black iron railing I'd chosen when we renovated 15 years ago. This house was as much a part of me as my own skin. And now a stranger owned it. A woman who had slept with my husband for 3 decades owned the home where I'd raised his child. I walked inside, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like coming home. It felt like trespassing. Chapter 2. The first night. Marianne stayed with me that first night. She made tea that neither of us drank and tried to start conversations I couldn't finish. Finally, she just sat with me in the living room, the silence between us heavy with all the things we couldn't say. Around midnight, she went to the guest room. I told her I'd be up soon, but I knew I wouldn't sleep. How could I sleep in the bed I'd shared with Winston, knowing he'd been living a double life? How could I close my eyes without seeing Vivian Prescott's face, that look of triumph as Garrett announced her significance? I walked through the house, really looking at it for the first time in years. The oriental rug in the dining room that I'd found at an estate sale. The grandfather clock in the hallway that had belonged to Winston's father. The photographs on the mantel. Our wedding day. Garrett's graduation. Family vacations that suddenly felt like staged productions. In Winston's study, I stood in the doorway. This had always been his private space, his sanctuary. I'd respected that boundary for decades, only entering to clean or deliver messages. Now I walked in and sat in his leather chair, still indented with the shape of his body. The desk was neat, organized exactly as Winston liked everything. Files arranged by importance, pens in their holder, a leather-bound calendar open to the week of his death. I flipped through it, looking at his appointments, lunch meetings, court dates, conference calls, and there, every Thursday evening at 7, V, just the letter. No explanation needed, because Winston never expected anyone to see this calendar but himself. I flipped backward through the weeks. V appeared like clockwork, every Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays too, occasionally on weekday lunches. 30 years of Thursdays. I opened the desk drawers methodically, not sure what I was looking for. The top drawer held office supplies. The second had files related to cases he'd worked on. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of legal journals, I found a box. It was wooden, small, with intricate carvings on the lid. Not the kind of thing Winston would typically own. He preferred clean lines, modern aesthetics. This box was ornate, almost feminine. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a ribbon. The paper was expensive, heavy stock in cream and pale blue. I untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. My dearest Winston, it began in elegant script. Today marks 25 years since we first met. 25 years of loving you, of being loved by you, of sharing a life that, while unconventional, has been more fulfilling than any traditional marriage could have been. I couldn't read further. My vision blurred with tears I'd been holding back since the funeral. 25 years ago would have been 1998. Garrett would have been 21. I'd been 52, believing I was happily married, planning our 25th anniversary celebration, which we'd had. I remembered it clearly. Dinner at our favorite restaurant. Garrett home from college for the occasion. Winston had given me a pearl necklace, kissed my cheek, told me he was grateful for our life together, and 5 years into his relationship with Vivian Prescott. I put the letter back without reading more. I couldn't bear it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. In the box were other items. A pressed flower. A ticket stub from a Broadway show. A show I'd never seen. A small silver key on a chain. And at the bottom, photographs. They were casual snapshots, the kind you take without thinking much about it. Winston and Vivian at a restaurant. Vivian laughing at something off camera. Winston with his arm around her shoulders, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. The two of them on a beach somewhere tropical. Winston in swim trunks, his skin tanned, his smile genuine. I hadn't been to a beach with Winston in over a decade. He'd always claimed he was too busy, that sand irritated him, that he burned easily. Lies, all lies. The last photograph stopped my breath. It showed Winston, Vivian, and Garrett. My son looked about 30 in the picture, which would make it roughly 15 years ago. They were at some kind of outdoor gathering, a barbecue perhaps. Garrett stood between them, an arm around each, all three smiling at the camera like a family that didn't include me. I don't know how long I sat there, holding that photograph, long enough that the autumn dawn started to lighten the sky outside the study windows, long enough that my legs went numb and my back ached from sitting still, long enough that the initial sharp pain of betrayal settled into something duller and more permanent. Marianne found me there around 7 in the morning. She took one look at my face, at the open box on the desk, and understood. "Oh, Jolie," she whispered, using the nickname she'd called me as children. "He's been with her since Garrett was 16, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Our entire adult son's life. Winston has been living with 1 foot in this house and 1 foot in her life. And Garrett knew. That's why he said she was more of a mother to him. Because she's been in his life for 30 years. Marianne sat down in the chair opposite the desk. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." I laughed. A hollow sound. "I don't even know what I can do. Apparently I don't own this house. I don't know what Winston left me in his will. I don't know anything about our finances. I was the wife. I managed the household, not the assets. You need a lawyer. All our friends are lawyers. Winston's colleagues. How do I even know who to trust?" Marianne pulled out her phone. "My friend Rachel's daughter is an attorney in Boston, estate law. She doesn't run in Winston's circles. Let me call her." While Marianne made the call, I looked around Winston's study. How many nights had he sat here, writing letters to Vivian? How many times had I brought him coffee or left him alone to work, never suspecting he was maintaining an entire second relationship from this room? The doorbell rang. We both jumped. It was barely 7:30 in the morning. Marianne went to answer it while I stayed in the study, suddenly unwilling to face whoever was at the door. I heard voices, Marianne's and a man's, and then footsteps approaching. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A young man in a suit appeared in the doorway, holding a briefcase. "I'm Officer Chen from the Suffolk County Court. I have documents for you." He handed me an envelope, official-looking and thick. I opened it with numb fingers. The words swam before my eyes. "Notice of eviction. Property ownership transferred. 30 days to vacate. Failure to comply will result in—" "Who sent this?" I asked. "The property owner, ma'am, a Ms. Vivian Prescott. She's requesting you vacate the premises within 30 days as stipulated in the last will and testament of Winston Whitmore." He left. Marianne and I stood in the hallway, the eviction notice in my hands. 30 days, I said. "And I have 30 days to leave the house where I've lived for 42 years. Marianne took the notice from me and read it carefully. "Jolie, something's not right here. Wills don't execute this quickly. Winston died 3 days ago. This is rushed. They're trying to push you out before you can get your bearings. Why would they do that? My sister looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Because maybe there's something they don't want you to find. Chapter 3. The attorney Rachel's daughter was named Morgan Fairchild. No relation to the actress, she assured me when we met 2 days later in her small but professional office in Cambridge. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that reminded me of Winston in his younger years. The comparison hurt. I'd brought everything. The eviction notice, the box from Winston's study, the calendar with its Thursday appointments, bank statements I'd managed to locate, insurance documents, even our marriage certificate. 48 years of a life together, reduced to paper evidence. Morgan reviewed everything methodically, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Marianne sat beside me, her presence a comfort, even though she'd need to fly back to Seattle soon. Mrs. Whitmore, Morgan said finally, I need to ask you some uncomfortable questions. Everything is uncomfortable now. Ask whatever you need. Did you know about Ms. Prescott before the funeral? No. Did your husband ever discuss his will with you? He said he'd taken care of everything, that I'd be provided for. I trusted him. Morgan's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or anger on my behalf. Did you work outside the home during your marriage? I worked as a teacher for the first 5 years we were married. After Garrett was born, Winston asked me to stay home. He said his career required a wife who could entertain clients, manage the household, be available for firm functions. I agreed. So you gave up your career to support his... It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. That's what wives did, especially wives married to ambitious lawyers. Morgan made another note. Mrs. Whitmore, here's what I need to tell you. First, this eviction notice is premature. Wills typically take months to probate. Even if the house was left to Ms. Prescott, she can't evict you this quickly. Second, in Massachusetts, you have certain rights as a surviving spouse, regardless of what the will says. You're entitled to an elective share of the estate. What does that mean? It means that even if Winston left everything to someone else, you can claim up to 1/3 of his estate. The law recognizes that a spouse contributes to marital assets even without direct financial contribution. Your 48 years of managing his household, supporting his career, raising his child, all of that has legal value. For the first time in days, I felt something other than crushing despair. It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was something. However, Morgan continued, and my brief flicker of relief dimmed. There are complications. You mentioned your son was at the funeral, supporting Missy Prescott's claim. Yes. Garrett introduced her as his true mother. That's going to be a problem. If your son testifies against you, if he claims his father's relationship with Ms. Prescott was the legitimate one, and you were somehow the interloper, it could complicate things. How could I be the interloper? I was married to Winston for 48 years. I know, but perception matters in court. They'll argue that the emotional reality of Winston's life was with Ms. Prescott, that the legal marriage to you was merely a formality he maintained out of obligation. It's not a strong argument, but combined with your son's testimony, it could sway a sympathetic judge. Marianne leaned forward. What about the house specifically? Can she really force Jolene out? Not this quickly. I'm going to file an emergency motion to stay the eviction. Given the circumstances, a judge will grant it. That'll buy us time to properly probate the will and contest its terms. Contest? I asked. Mrs. Whitmore. A will that leaves everything to a mistress while leaving nothing to a wife of 48 years raises questions. Questions about undue influence, mental capacity, even the authenticity of the document itself. I want to examine Winston's will very carefully. I want to know when it was written, who witnessed it, whether he was properly represented by independent counsel. She pulled out a form and slid it across the desk. I need you to sign this, retaining me as your attorney. Then I need you to go home and find every financial document you can. Bank statements, investment accounts, retirement funds, life insurance policies, deeds, titles to cars, everything. We need to know exactly what assets existed in this marriage. I signed the form with shaking hands. One more thing, Morgan said. I need you to be prepared for this to get ugly. Ms. Prescott and your son have clearly planned this. The speed of that eviction notice tells me they have an attorney who's been working on this for a while, possibly even before Winston died. They're going to fight hard to keep what they consider theirs. It is mine, I said quietly. 48 years of my life is mine. This house where I raised my son is mine. The life I built, even if it was built on lies, is mine. Morgan smiled, and it wasn't a gentle smile. It was the smile of a woman ready for battle. Then let's go to war. After the meeting, Marianne and I went to a small cafe near Harvard Square. She had to leave the next morning, and I could see she was worried about abandoning me. I'll be fine, I told her, though I wasn't sure I believed it. You have your own life, your own family. I can't expect you to put everything on hold. You're my sister, Jolie. You're allowed to need me. I've never been good at needing people. I know. That's always been your problem. We sat in silence for a moment, watching students hurry past the window, young people with their whole lives ahead of them, unaware of how quickly those lives could be revealed as illusions. Do you think Winston ever loved me? I asked suddenly. Marianne reached across the table and took my hand. I think he loved you in the way he was capable of loving, but I also think he was a selfish man who wanted everything: the respectable wife, the perfect family, and the passionate affair. He wanted to have it all, and he didn't care what it cost you. I gave him everything. I know you did, and that's what makes this so unfair. That night, back in the house that might not be mine much longer, I began searching for financial documents. Winston's study yielded files on investments I didn't know existed. The safe in our bedroom, which I'd rarely opened, contained insurance policies, stock certificates, and deeds to properties I'd never heard of. Each discovery was another knife wound. A vacation home in Vermont I'd never visited. Investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars I'd never known about. A life insurance policy with Vivian Prescott listed as the beneficiary. Winston had been a wealthy man, much wealthier than I'd realized, and he'd been carefully organizing his assets to ensure that wealth went to Vivian. But he'd made one critical mistake. The house on Beacon Hill, our home, had been purchased early in our marriage, before Winston's career took off, before he met Vivian, and I found the deed, yellowed with age, with both our names on it, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I might not know much about law, but I knew what that meant. When Winston died, his share of the house automatically became mine. The entire house was mine. Vivian Prescott had no legal claim to it whatsoever. Whatever Will Winston had written, whatever instructions he'd left, didn't matter. The house was mine before he died, and it remained mine after. I called Morgan immediately, even though it was nearly midnight. I found the deed, I said when she answered. The house is mine. He couldn't have left it to her because it was never his alone to leave. Are you absolutely certain? You're listed on the deed? Yes. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Both our names. Mrs. Whitmore. That's excellent news. That eviction notice is completely invalid. First thing tomorrow morning, I'm calling whoever represents Ms. Prescott and telling them to back off. After I hung up, I walked through the house again. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like mine. They'd tried to take it from me. My own son had stood at his father's grave and told me I had to leave. But they were wrong. This house was mine, and I wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 4. The battle begins. Morgan moved quickly. By the end of that week, she'd filed multiple motions: a stay on the eviction, a request to examine Winston's will, and a formal claim for my elective share of the estate. She'd also sent a strongly worded letter to Vivian Prescott's attorney, explaining that the Beacon Hill house belonged to me, and any attempt to claim it would be met with a countersuit for harassment. The response came swiftly. Vivian's attorney, a woman named Patricia Thornhill from one of Boston's most aggressive firms, filed counter-motions arguing that I'd abandoned my rights to the marital estate by being an absent and negligent wife. They claimed I'd been emotionally unavailable, that Winston had sought companionship elsewhere due to my failures as a spouse, and that I had no moral right to assets he'd accumulated largely without my contribution. Reading those documents felt like being slapped repeatedly. Every paragraph was designed to paint me as cold, distant, undeserving. They cited examples: how I'd declined to attend certain firm functions, neglecting to mention those were the same nights Garrett had school events I prioritized; how I'd spent time volunteering at the local library, neglecting to mention Winston had encouraged this as suitable activity for a lawyer's wife; how I'd maintained separate bank accounts, neglecting to mention these were small accounts for household expenses, with trivial amounts compared to Winston's wealth; But the worst part was the affidavit from Garrett. My son had written a detailed statement describing how Vivian had been a constant presence in his life since high school, how she'd attended his tennis matches when I couldn't, because I was home cooking dinner for Winston's colleagues, how she'd helped him with college applications. I'd had no idea he needed help. He never asked. How she'd been there for him through his divorce 5 years ago, a divorce I'd learned about 2 weeks after the fact, when Garrett called to inform me, not invite me to help. In Garrett's telling, I was a ghost mother, present in body but absent in spirit, and Vivian was the warm, engaged parent who'd filled the void I'd left. It's character assassination, Morgan explained when we met to review the filings. They're trying to justify Winston's betrayal by making you the villain. It's a common tactic in these cases. Is it working? Not legally. Your rights as a surviving spouse don't depend on being a perfect wife. But emotionally, they know this hurts you. That's part of their strategy, to make you too wounded to fight. What do? We gather our own evidence. I need people who can testify to your character, to your contributions to the marriage. Friends, neighbors, anyone who knew you and Winston as a couple. That's when I realized the full extent of my isolation. Winston's friends were lawyers and judges, people I'd entertained but never truly befriended. Our neighbors were cordial but distant. Beacon Hill wasn't the kind of place where people became close. My own friends from before the marriage had drifted away over the decades, lost to moves and life changes, and my own failure to maintain relationships outside my role as Winston's wife. The person I was closest to was Marianne, and she lived across the country. What about the library where you volunteered? Morgan suggested. Or your church. I hadn't been to church in years. Winston found it tedious, and I'd stopped going to avoid arguing about it. The library had other volunteers who might remember me, but we'd never socialized outside those shifts. I'd spent 48 years being Winston Whitmore's wife, and I'd forgotten to be Jolene Whitmore, an individual with her own relationships and connections. I'll find people, I promised Morgan, though I had no idea where to start. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for mid-November, just 6 weeks away. That hearing would determine whether the eviction could proceed and set the stage for the larger battle over Winston's estate. I spent those weeks in a strange limbo. Technically, I still lived in my house, but Vivian's attorney had made it clear they'd be pursuing the eviction aggressively. I'd receive regular letters reminding me that I was occupying Ms. Prescott's property and that my continued presence constituted trespass. I stopped answering the phone. The few times I did, it was either reporters, somehow the story had leaked to the press, prominent attorney's secret life revealed in a state battle, or people I barely knew offering sympathy that felt more like curiosity. Garrett didn't call. Not once. I thought about calling him, trying to understand how we'd arrived at this place where my own child was testifying against me. But every time I picked up the phone, I remembered his face at the funeral, the certainty in his voice when he called Vivian his true mother. Some betrayals cut too deep for phone calls to heal. I did find one ally, unexpectedly. Her name was Dorothy Hastings, and she'd been Winston's secretary for 20 years. She called me 3 weeks after the funeral. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know if you remember me. Of course I do, Dorothy. You always made sure Winston ate lunch. I was grateful for that. There was a pause on the line. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to tell you something. About Ms. Prescott. We met at a small diner in Somerville, far from anywhere we might encounter people from Winston's world. Dorothy was in her early 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes that looked troubled. I never meant to keep secrets from you, she began, but it wasn't my place to tell you about the situation. You knew about Vivian. Everyone in the office knew. She'd call, and Winston would take the calls in his private office. She'd show up sometimes, and he'd leave early to meet her. It was an open secret. For 30 years, Dorothy nodded miserably. But here's what you need to know. About 6 months ago, things changed. Winston started preparing. He met with estate attorneys, not the ones at his own firm, but specialists. He updated his will. He transferred assets. It was like he was planning for something. Planning for his death? Maybe. Or planning for a divorce. I'm not sure which. But I overheard him on the phone with Ms. Prescott one day. He was upset, almost angry, which wasn't like him. He said something like, "I've given you 30 years, Vivian. You need to be patient." She must have said something back, because then he said, I can't just abandon Jolene without protection. I owe her that much. My heart was pounding. What does that mean? I don't know. But it makes me think that maybe his final will, the one Mrs. Prescott is using, might not have been what Winston actually wanted. Maybe she pushed him to change things before he was ready. Dorothy reached across the table and took my hand. I should have told you years ago. About the affair. About everything. I justified my silence by thinking it wasn't my business. But the truth is, I was protecting my job. Winston was a powerful man, and I didn't want to cross him. I'm sorry. What made you come forward now? Because what's happening to you isn't right. You don't deserve this. And I have information that might help. She pulled out a flash drive. Before Winston died, he kept certain files on his personal computer. Files about his estate planning, his financial dealings. I backed up his computer regularly as part of my duties. This is the most recent backup, from 2 weeks before he died. Why are you giving this to me? Because whatever else Winston was, whatever mistakes he made, I don't think he wanted this. I don't think he wanted you thrown out of your home with nothing. Ms. Prescott might have the will, but you might have the truth. I took the flash drive with trembling hands. Morgan was ecstatic when I showed her. This is potentially huge. If Winston was having second thoughts, if there's evidence he was being pressured by Miss Prescott to change his will, we can argue undue influence. Let me get our IT specialist to examine this. The files revealed a complex picture. Winston had indeed transferred significant assets to Vivian over the years. The Vermont property, investment accounts, even a substantial amount of cash. But he'd also maintained separate accounts that she didn't know about. Accounts with my name as the beneficiary. Accounts worth nearly $2 million. There were also draft versions of wills. Multiple drafts, showing Winston's changing intentions. The earliest version, from 5 years ago, left everything to Vivian. But subsequent drafts gradually increased my share, as though Winston was trying to balance his obligations to both of us. The final version, the one that had been executed 3 months before his death, left the house to Vivian, apparently unaware it couldn't be legally transferred, but created a substantial trust fund for me, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. So he did try to provide for me, I said quietly. It appears so, but here's what's interesting. Morgan pointed to dates on the documents. The trust fund was established 3 months ago, but the accounts funding it were emptied 2 weeks before Winston died. Someone transferred the money out. Who? That's what we need to find out. But if I had to guess, I'd say Miss Prescott had access to these accounts and cleaned them out before Winston died, possibly even while he was in the hospital after his heart attack. She stole from me. If we can prove it, yes. And that changes everything. Chapter 5. The Truth Emerges. The hearing in mid-November was held in a somber courtroom in downtown Boston. Judge Helena Morrison presided, a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I sat with Morgan at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, Vivian Prescott sat with Patricia Thornhill and an associate. It was the first time I'd seen Vivian since the funeral. She looked elegant in a navy suit, her silver blonde hair styled perfectly. She didn't look at me, not once. Garrett sat behind her, his hands clasped in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point on the wall. My son still couldn't look at me. The hearing focused on the eviction notice and my claim to the house. Patricia Thornhill argued aggressively that the house had been Winston's to leave to whomever he chose, that my presence in it was preventing Miss Prescott from taking possession of her rightful inheritance. Morgan countered with the deed, showing clearly that the house was held in joint tenancy. She explained patiently, as though teaching a first-year law student, that joint tenancy meant automatic transfer to the surviving owner upon death. Winston could no more leave the house to Vivienne than he could leave the moon. Judge Morrison's expression suggested she didn't appreciate having her time wasted with such a clear-cut issue. Ms. Thornhill, did you review the deed before filing this eviction notice? Your Honor, the deed may be in both names, but our client was led to believe what your client was led to believe is irrelevant. The law is clear. The house belongs to Mrs. Whitmore. The eviction notice is void. Is there anything else? Or are we done here? Patricia Thornhill stood firm. Your Honor, we'd like to address the broader issue of the estate. Mrs. Whitmore is claiming an elective share. but we contend that she abandoned her marital responsibilities and has no moral or legal right to assets her husband accumulated through his own efforts. This is an eviction hearing, not a full probate proceeding. We understand, Your Honor, but the issues are intertwined. If we could present evidence of Mrs. Whitmore's abandonment, you may present your evidence at the appropriate proceeding. For now, the eviction is denied. Mrs. Whitmore will remain in her home. Next case. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. As we left the courtroom, I saw Vivian speaking urgently with her attorney. For the first time, she looked worried. Good. Let her worry. But the battle was far from over. 2 weeks later, we were back in court for the first probate hearing. This time, the stakes were higher. This was about Winston's entire estate, about my right to claim a share of the wealth accumulated during our 48 years of marriage. Patricia Thornhill came out swinging. She called witnesses who testified to Winston and Vivian's relationship. A maitre d' from a restaurant where they'd dined weekly for years. A travel agent who'd booked them trips to Europe. Winston's best friend from college, who admitted Winston had confided in him about Vivian from the beginning. Each testimony was designed to paint a picture. Winston's real life had been with Vivian. I was merely a legal inconvenience he'd maintained out of obligation. Then Garrett took the stand. Watching my son sworn in, watching him promise to tell the truth, knowing what he was about to say, it was almost more than I could bear. Patricia Thornhill led him through his testimony gently, sympathetically. Tell us about your childhood, Garrett. Tell us about your relationship with your mother. And Garrett did. He described a household where I was physically present but emotionally absent. A mother who cooked meals but never asked about his day. A mother who attended some school events but never really engaged with his life. And Ms. Prescott, Patricia asked, what role did she play? Vivian was there for me in ways my mother never was. She listened. She cared. She knew my friends, names, my teachers, what I was struggling with. When I had my first heartbreak, it was Vivian I called, not my mother. Did you ever tell your mother about Ms. Prescott? I tried, once, when I was in college. I told her I'd met an important woman in Dad's life. She said she didn't want to hear about Dad's work colleagues. He paused. She didn't want to know. It was easier for her to pretend everything was fine. Morgan cross-examined carefully. Mr. Whitmore, you were 16 when your father began his relationship with Missy Prescott. Yes. Did your father tell you about the affair? He didn't hide it. Not from me. Did he ask you to keep it secret from your mother? Garrett hesitated. He said it would hurt her unnecessarily. So you participated in deceiving your mother for 30 years. I was protecting her. By lying to her. By allowing her to believe she had a faithful husband and a devoted son. Objection? Patricia Thornhill called. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Move on, Miss Fairchild. Morgan shifted tactics. Mr. Whitmore, you said your mother was emotionally absent. Can you give me specific examples? Garrett listed them. Missed tennis matches, forgotten birthdays, conversations cut short. With each example, Morgan asked follow-up questions that revealed a more complex picture. Yes, she missed the tennis match, because she was at the hospital with your grandfather when he was dying. Yes, she forgot your 16th birthday, because she was recovering from surgery and on pain medication. Yes, conversations were cut short, because she was managing your father's demanding household schedule. By the end of Morgan's cross-examination, Garrett looked less certain, as though seeing his childhood through a different lens for the first time. But the damage had been done. A son had testified against his mother. The judge had heard it. The court had recorded it. Morgan presented our evidence next. Dorothy Hastings testified about Winston's last-minute changes to his estate plan, about his apparent uncertainty. Our IT specialist testified about the suspicious transfer of funds from the accounts meant to provide for me. And then Morgan played her trump card. She had found the bank employee who'd processed the transfer, a nervous young man named Timothy Chen, who testified that Ms. Prescott had come in 2 days after Winston's heart attack, while Winston was sedated in the ICU, with a power of attorney and instructions to transfer the funds to accounts in her name. Did you verify the power of attorney? Morgan asked. It looked legitimate. Ms. Prescott said Mr. Whitmore had given it to her before the heart attack, in case of emergency. Did you speak with Mr. Whitmore to confirm? He was in the ICU. I couldn't. Did you try to contact Mrs. Whitmore The legal spouse. Timothy Chen looked down. No. Ms. Prescott said they were separated, and Mrs. Whitmore wasn't involved in Mr. Whitmore's financial affairs. So you took the word of a woman claiming to have power of attorney without verification, and transferred $2 million out of accounts that had Mrs. Whitmore listed as the beneficiary. When you put it that way, how should I put it, Mr. Chen? He had no answer. After 2 days of testimony, Judge Morrison called for a recess. We'd reconvene in 2 weeks for closing arguments and her ruling. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I stayed in my house, legally confirmed, but it felt like living in a museum of my former life. Every room held memories that were now suspect. Had Winston been thinking of Vivian when he kissed me goodbye each morning? Had he been comparing us when we made love? Had every "I love you" been a lie? Marianne called daily from Seattle, but there was little she could do except listen. Morgan worked tirelessly, preparing closing arguments, anticipating Patricia Thornhill's strategies, and I waited. Chapter 6. The Verdict. The courtroom was packed when we reconvened. Somehow, the case had captured public attention. The Beacon Hill betrayal, one newspaper had dubbed it. People were fascinated by the story of the respected attorney with a secret life, the wronged wife, the other woman, the son caught between them. I hated being a spectacle, but I held my head high as Morgan and I took our seats. Patricia Thornhill delivered her closing argument with passion. She painted Vivian as the true victim, a woman who'd loved Winston faithfully for decades, but been denied the recognition she deserved because of outdated laws that privileged legal marriage over emotional truth. She portrayed me as a woman who'd been given everything: a beautiful home, financial security, social status, and contributed nothing in return. Mrs. Whitmore lived a life of comfort, while Vivian Prescott lived in the shadows, Patricia declared. Winston Whitmore made his wishes clear. He wanted to provide for the woman who'd actually been his partner. The fact that he was legally married to someone else shouldn't override his express intentions. Morgan's closing was quieter, but no less powerful. Your Honor, this case isn't about emotion or passion or who loved whom more. It's about law, and the law is clear. Jolene Whitmore was Winston Whitmore's legal wife for 48 years. She raised his son. She managed his household. She supported his career in countless invisible ways that enabled his success. The law recognizes these contributions. The law protects surviving spouses precisely because marriage is more than just emotion. It's a legal partnership with rights and responsibilities. Ms. Prescott may have been Winston Whitmore's mistress. She may even have been his emotional partner, but she wasn't his wife. And wives have rights under Massachusetts law that mistresses don't. Those rights exist for a reason. They exist to protect people exactly like Jolene Whitmore, people who structure their entire lives around a marital partnership, only to discover that partnership was undermined. Moreover, the evidence shows that Ms. Prescott didn't just benefit from Winston's will, she actively stole from accounts designated for Mrs. Whitmore. She used questionable powers of attorney to transfer assets while Winston was incapacitated. This isn't a woman exercising her rights. This is a woman exploiting an elderly man's final days to enrich herself at his widow's expense. Judge Morrison listened to both arguments without visible reaction. When both attorneys finished, she announced she'd issue her ruling in 1 week. 7 more days of waiting. I spent that week doing something I hadn't done in years. I got to know my house. Not as Winston's wife managing Winston's home, but as Jolene Whitmore, the person who actually lived there. I rearranged furniture in the living room, moving pieces from where Winston had insisted they go to where I actually wanted them. I cleaned out his study, boxing up his books and papers, transforming the space into something lighter and less oppressive. I went through his closet, donating his expensive suits to charity, reclaiming the space. Each change felt like reclaiming territory. This was my house. Whatever the judge decided about money and assets, this physical space was mine, and I was making it feel like mine. On the 6th day, Garrett called. "Mom?" His voice was tentative, uncertain. "Hello, Garrett. I was wondering if we could talk. Before the ruling. I need to explain some things. To you. Please. Can I come by?" I almost said no. Almost. But some part of me, the part that had carried him for 9 months, raised him for 18 years, loved him even when he hurt me, couldn't refuse. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. He arrived exactly on time, looking thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. We sat in the living room, the space feeling vast between us. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "about my testimony, about what I said, about how Vivian was more of a mother to me than I was." He flinched at my tone. "It's more complicated than that." "Is it? Because it sounded quite simple when you said it in court." "Mom, I was angry. I've been angry for a long time. At me." "For what?" "For not fighting harder for Dad's attention. For not demanding more from him. For just accepting how things were." I stared at my son. "You're angry at me for not knowing about an affair your father hid from me. For not competing with a woman I didn't know existed. You had to know something was wrong. Dad was never home. He missed everything. And you just let it happen." "What would you have had me do, Garrett? Interrogate your father? Hire private investigators? Destroy our family based on suspicions? You could have asked questions. I trusted him." The words burst out of me, raw and honest. "I trusted your father. That was my crime, Garrett. I believed my husband when he said he loved me. I believed him when he said he was working late. I believed him because that's what wives of my generation did. We trusted. We supported. We didn't question." Garrett's face crumpled. "But you were so lonely, Mom. Even when I was a kid, I could see how lonely you were. And instead of doing something about it, you just endured." "Yes, I endured. Because that's what I thought love was. Endurance. Sacrifice. Making yourself smaller so the people you love can be bigger. And now, look where it got you." I felt something inside me harden. Where it got me? I'll tell you where it got me, Garrett. It got me a house I own outright. It got me legal rights your father's mistress doesn't have. It got me the moral high ground and the law on my side. I endured for 48 years. And you know what? I'm still standing. Can Vivienne say the same? She had 30 years of stolen moments and hotel rooms and lies. I had a marriage. Flawed, maybe. One-sided, certainly. But legal and recognized and protected by law. Is that enough for you? Just being legal? Right now, yes. Because legal means I'm not homeless. Legal means I have rights. Legal means I matter. Even if your father and his mistress and apparently my own son think I don't." Garrett stood up, pacing to the window. "I don't think you don't matter. I never thought that. Then why did you testify against me?" He turned to face me, tears in his eyes. "Because Vivienne asked me to. Because she said it would honor Dad's wishes. Because I was so angry at you for never fighting for our family that I wanted you to feel what it was like to lose something. The honesty of it struck me like a physical blow. You wanted to hurt me. Yes." He was crying now. "Yes, I wanted to hurt you. I wanted you to feel as hurt as I'd felt watching our family fall apart without you even seeming to notice. I noticed, Garrett. I noticed every single day. I just didn't know what to do about it." We stood there, mother and son, separated by years of misunderstanding and pain. Finally, Garrett spoke. "I'm sorry. For what I said at the funeral, for my testimony, for all of it. I was wrong. Are you going to tell the judge that?" He hesitated. "I don't know if that would help or hurt at this point. It's not about helping or hurting, Garrett. It's about truth. You testified under oath. If that testimony was false, you have an obligation to correct it. It wasn't all false. You were distant. You did miss things. And were those absences because I didn't care? Or because I was managing an entire household and your father's career while raising you essentially alone?" Garrett didn't answer. "I think you should go," I said quietly. "We both have a lot to think about." He left. I sat in the living room alone, feeling hollowed out but also, strangely, stronger. I'd said things to my son I'd never said before. I'd defended myself instead of accepting his accusations. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was honest. And right now, honesty felt more valuable than peace. The next day, Judge Morrison issued her ruling. Chapter 7. The ruling. Morgan called me at 8 in the morning. "The ruling is posted. We need to meet." Her voice was carefully neutral, which told me nothing. I dressed mechanically, my hands shaking as I buttoned my blouse. Whatever the judge had decided would determine the rest of my life. Morgan's office was already full when I arrived. She had the ruling printed out, marked with highlighter and notes. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. I sat. Judge Morrison ruled largely in your favor. You're entitled to your elective share of the estate, 1/3 of everything Winston owned. The house is confirmed as yours, which we already knew. The Vermont property goes to Mr. Prescott, as does the investment account Winston specifically designated for her, but everything else gets divided, with you receiving the larger share due to the length of the marriage and your contributions. Relief flooded through me. So I won. Financially, yes. You'll be comfortable for the rest of your life. But there's more. Of course there was. Judge Morrison also addressed the fund transfers. She found that Ms. Prescott exceeded the scope of her power of attorney and essentially stole $2 million from accounts designated for you. She's ordered Mrs. Prescott to return those funds, plus interest. That's good, right? It's very good, but here's the difficult part. The judge also addressed Garrett's testimony. She noted that it revealed troubling family dynamics and suggested that both you and your son might benefit from family counseling before any reconciliation. The words stung, even coming from a judge who'd ruled in my favor. She's saying I'm a bad mother. She's saying you and Garrett have unresolved issues, which is true. But she also made clear that those issues don't affect your legal rights as Winston's widow. Morgan pulled out another document. There's one more thing. Miss Prescott's attorney has already filed a notice of appeal. This isn't over. How long will an appeal take? Months. Maybe more than a year. But honestly, Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think they have grounds. Judge Morrison was thorough. She anticipated the appeal and made her reasoning ironclad. My guess is they're just trying to pressure you into a settlement. I'm not settling. I was hoping you'd say that. Over the next few weeks, the reality of the ruling became clear. I had won legally, but the victory felt hollow. Vivian Prescott was still in Garrett's life. My son still believed his father's mistress was more of a parent than I'd been. The money meant I'd be comfortable, but it couldn't buy back the 48 years I'd lost to a lie. I received the first distribution from Winston's estate in January. It was surreal, seeing that much money in my account. Money I'd earned not through work, but through endurance. Through 48 years of being a wife to a man who'd been a husband to someone else, I donated a significant portion to organizations supporting women in difficult transitions, divorce, widowhood, domestic situations they needed to leave. If my suffering could ease someone else's path, at least it would mean something. I also hired a contractor to renovate the house. Not just cosmetic changes, but structural ones. I knocked down walls that Winston had insisted stay up. I installed windows where he'd preferred darkness. I turned his study into a library, filling it with books I wanted to read, not legal texts and case files. Each change felt like exorcising ghosts. In March, Vivian Prescott's appeal was denied. Her attorney had argued that Judge Morrison had been biased, that the ruling gave too much weight to legal marriage over emotional reality. The appeals court disagreed. The original ruling stood. I received a call from Patricia Thornhill the day after the appeal was denied. Mrs. Whitmore, my client would like to propose a settlement. The court already ruled. Yes, but continued litigation benefits no one. Ms. Prescott is willing to forego any further claims if you agree to allow her to purchase certain items from the Beacon Hill house. Personal items that held sentimental value for Mr. Whitmore. What items? She listed them. A painting from Winston's study, a set of first-edition law books, a desk that had belonged to his father, various other objects that apparently meant something to Vivian. And in exchange, she drops all claims. No more appeals, no more litigation. You keep your share of the estate, she keeps hers, and we all move on. I thought about it. About whether holding on to Winston's possessions mattered. Whether making Vivian suffer brought me any peace. Tell Ms. Prescott. She can have the items. I don't want payment. I just want this to end. That's very generous. It's not generosity. It's exhaustion. A week later, a moving truck arrived at the house. Vivian came with it, her first time back since the funeral. I watched from the window as she directed the movers, touching each item as though greeting old friends. I could have stayed inside, could have avoided seeing her, but something made me go outside, stand on the front steps, wait for her to notice me. When she did, she froze. We stood 10 feet apart, two women who'd loved the same man, who'd both lost him in different ways. I suppose you feel victorious, Vivian said finally. Do you? She didn't answer. You had him for 30 years, I said. Thursdays, weekends, secret trips, while I had the ring and the vows and apparently nothing else that mattered. He loved me. I'm sure he did. But he married me. And he stayed married to me. For 48 years. He came home to me. That has to mean something. It means he was a coward, Vivian said bitterly. And too afraid of what divorce would do to his reputation. Too worried about what his colleagues would think. So he kept both of us. You as the respectable wife. Me as the hidden love. And now you're the one who's hidden. I'm the widow. I get the obituary mention. I get the estate. You get memories and stolen items from his study. Vivian's composure cracked. She looked old suddenly, and tired. Do you think you won? No. But neither did you. Winston did. He got everything he wanted. Both of us. Never having to choose. And we both lost years of our lives to a man who couldn't be honest with either of us. She didn't respond. Just turned back to the movers, directing them to load the last items. I watched as the truck pulled away, taking pieces of Winston's life to wherever Vivian lived. A place I'd never seen, that had been his refuge for 3 decades. I went back inside my house, empty of Winston's presence now, ready to be filled with something new. Chapter 8. Moving forward. Spring arrived in Boston with its usual tentative warmth. I spent April working with a landscape designer to redo the garden. Winston had liked formal English gardens, neat and controlled. I wanted wildflowers, native plants, spaces for birds and butterflies. Another way of reclaiming the space, Garrett called occasionally. Our conversations were stilted, careful. Neither of us knew how to bridge the gap that had opened between us. He never apologized for his testimony. Not really. And I never forgave him for it. Not completely. Some hurts go too deep for easy resolution. But we tried. Small steps. He came for brunch one Sunday in May. We talked about neutral topics. His work, his daughters, the weather. It was more than we'd had in years, but less than what a mother and son should share. Dorothy Hastings became an unexpected friend. She'd retired after Winston's death, unwilling to continue at the firm without him. We started meeting for coffee every few weeks. She told me stories about Winston I'd never known. His kindness to junior associates, his meticulous attention to detail, his occasional bursts of humor. He was a good man in many ways, Dorothy said one afternoon, but he was also weak. He wanted everyone to think well of him, and that made him dishonest. He couldn't bear to disappoint anyone, so he disappointed everyone by trying to please them all. It was the most accurate assessment of Winston I'd heard. In June, I joined a book club at the library where I'd once volunteered. A group of women, most around my age, meeting weekly to discuss novels and memoirs. They knew who I was. The Boston papers had covered the trial extensively, but they didn't treat me as a curiosity, just as another woman looking for connection and conversation. One of the women, Ruth Castellano, became particularly close. She'd been widowed 5 years earlier, her husband dying suddenly of an aneurysm. She understood the strange mix of grief and relief that comes from losing a spouse who wasn't quite what you thought they were. My husband wasn't unfaithful, Ruth told me over tea one afternoon, but he was absent in other ways, emotionally unavailable, always focused on his next business deal, his next achievement. I was an accessory, not a partner. When he died, I mourned, but I also felt this weight lift, the weight of trying to be enough for someone who didn't really see me. Do you think that's terrible? I asked, feeling relieved that your husband died. I think it's honest. And honesty matters more than seemly emotions. Through Ruth, I met other women with similar stories. Women who'd devoted decades to marriages that weren't what they appeared. Women who'd survived and were trying to figure out who they were beyond being wives. We formed our own informal support group, meeting for dinners, going to museums together, taking a weekend trip to the Cape in August. I was building something I'd never had. Friendships based on who I was, not who I was married to. In September, a year after Winston's death, I made a decision. I was going to sell the house. Morgan was surprised when I told her, "You fought so hard for it." I fought because it was mine, because I wasn't going to let them take it from me. But I don't need to live here. This house is full of ghosts. Where will you go? I don't know yet. Somewhere smaller, maybe closer to Cambridge, near the library and the book club. Somewhere I can walk to coffee shops and parks. Somewhere that's mine from the beginning, not filled with 48 years of memories. The house sold quickly. A young couple with 2 children. excited about the historic beacon.